Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to That OA Thing, where we discuss the latest issues from across the Ombudsman landscape. I'm Donal Galligan, Chief Executive of the Ombudsman Association, and joining us today is Ger Deering, the Ombudsman for Ireland. We're going to talk about the Ombudsman's work in seeking to improve the availability and quality of public services to people with disabilities, and the outreach work his office is doing to ensure its services reach those who need them most. Welcome, Ger. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Donald. It's great to be here.
Well, to start us off, could you give us a brief overview of the role of the Office of the Ombudsman?
Sure. I suppose, like most ombudsman offices, we deal with complaints against public service providers. So that's a very broad range of public service providers here in Ireland. It's really any public body that's funded with taxpayer money. And in our case, it even extends to private nursing homes because, again, they're funded significantly through the public purse. Last year, we received about 4,700 complaints. And again, like most offices that I'm aware of, that's an increase, and it's been increasing over the years. I'd like to think that that's because there are so many new public services coming online and that the population is growing, rather than that there are issues developing. But we're constantly dealing and coming across new issues. So we seek to resolve the complaints informally at first, and despite the increase that we've received, we're still managing to resolve about 80% of complaints in 3 months. And they would be resolved mainly informally, where a person either gets what it was that they were looking for or indeed gets an explanation or an answer as to why they didn't get it. And then the rest of the complaints might go on to formal investigation and could take 6 months or longer in some cases. We also have the power of own initiative investigation, which is a really, really useful initiative. And in fact, the office over the years has undertaken quite a number of own initiative investigations that have brought about improvements right across the services that are delivered to the public service. I think that's sometimes a very powerful tool that we can use where we see maybe systemic problems or issues that are affecting people. So many people actually benefit from the services of the office who don't even come to us, who may not have made a complaint in the first place.
Oh, well, that's really helpful to explain. And again, the broad powers that you have and those kind of best practice powers that unfortunately some of your colleagues in the UK and elsewhere don't have yet. So it's going to be great to hear a bit more about that. One of the major investigations your predecessor undertook was the Weighted Lives report in relation to younger people with a disability having to live inappropriately in nursing homes. For those of our listeners who might not be aware, could you tell us a bit about the impact of that report and about the current situation?
Sure. Yes, Peter Tyndall, as you say, identified this as an issue based on a number of complaints that had come to our office where people were finding themselves inappropriately living in nursing homes. We termed young people as people under the age of 65 who had a disability but didn't need to be in a nursing home. And actually, the title itself can be a little bit emotive, wasted lives. But in fact, it was one of the participants in the investigation who said, my life has been wasted in this institution. And it's not a reflection on nursing homes. Nursing homes are there and serve a very good purpose for older people who need that type of care. What people don't realize or didn't realize was that some of the people, indeed one person I was aware of was actually at work, had a job and went to work, came back to a nursing home in the evening, and you couldn't have your friends in, you couldn't have the life that everybody else wants to live and that everybody wants to live. So the investigation established that there were about 1,300 people in that situation. Some had been in nursing homes for a very long time. So Peter's investigation made a number of recommendations, and unfortunately the response was slow, and the implementation of the recommendations was very slow in getting off the ground because of COVID. As you can probably imagine, the health service here had its focus in other areas. But I'm pleased to say that after that, even during COVID, but particularly after COVID, the HSE, the Health Service Executive, really engaged with the office and put what they called an under 65 programme in place. The work that was required was, in the first instance, was very heavily front-loaded, if I can put it that way, because a lot of work needed to be done in working with people in the nursing homes, first of all, to assess what were their needs, and the needs vary completely. For example, some people actually had their own home that they could go to, but it needed to be adapted, or the person might have needed actually to have an assessment. For example, one person we came across, they needed an occupational assessment, an occupational therapist to carry out an assessment to decide what kind of wheelchair they would need. Now, the difficulty we came up against there was the HSE said, well, we don't do occupational therapy assessments for people in nursing homes. So we had a ridiculous situation where a home was available and the person needed this assessment. We got that sorted. And I'm only giving that as one example of there were many cases like that. And what the HSE did as well was they engaged with NGOs and support groups who work with people with disabilities, and they did a lot of the preparatory work. So far, 101 people, not enough, but 101 people have actually transitioned out of nursing homes into various other types of accommodation. Some, as I say, went back to their own homes or their own families. Some went to new homes. Others went to other care facilities that were much more suitable. I visited actually one of the homes last year, and I met 4 of the people who had transitioned, and it was amazing. One person had just come back from holidays. They'd never been on holidays because you don't have the support to go on holidays from a nursing home. One person had transitioned after 35 years. He had had an accident at 21 years of age. And 35 years later, he now had transitioned out into a home. And he was watching some sort of wrestling on the television while I was there, and then went off to get his daily newspaper. Again, I stress, one of the other residents was going to bingo that night. You know, the demands are not major. They're just to do the ordinary things of life, but the support was necessary for that. So I'm glad to say that the HSE has embraced the programme, put this under 65 programme in place. It's not just about the individuals that are transitioning out. They're also putting a huge amount of support in to help staff to try and avoid people going into nursing homes in the first place. And in particular, and we're not that concerned if somebody has to transition out of a hospital into a nursing home for a short period of time till suitable accommodation can be found, because we understand the pressures the hospitals are under to move patients on when they can do no more for them. But our issue is the fact that they stay too long in the nursing home afterwards. It's a great outcome. Having said that, it has not happened fast enough, and it is still not happening fast enough. And we now have a situation where there are question marks over some of the funding. So I will keep the pressure on government to ensure that the programme continues to develop and continues to be funded into the future.
Well, it's, as you say, it's great to hear the progress that there has been, and you talk about those simple things as well. It's achievable, isn't it? If the time and the resources are there. So it's great to hear that you're going to keep an eye on this, and I guess we'll wait to hear more about how that progresses. I know your office also recently carried out an investigation into treatment abroad schemes, where the HSE was adopting, I think, an overly prescriptive approach to applicants to the schemes. Did that also have an impact on people with disabilities?
It certainly did, because unfortunately, as we know, people with disabilities generally have a higher need for treatment in general. And these schemes are designed for 2 people. One is the schemes themselves, I should stress, are very good, and a lot of people benefit from them. The 2 types of arrangements are, if a treatment is available abroad and not available in Ireland, then the state will actually pay for the person to travel and have the treatment. As you can imagine, some people with disabilities, particularly less common disabilities or newer disabilities that are only being recognised, they tend to need to travel for treatment abroad. Also, if the treatment is available here but it takes too long, if the waiting list is too long, people can travel abroad. In one instance, the state actually pays directly for the treatment, but in the vast majority of cases, you go and you have the treatment done, and then you return and you're reimbursed here. We found an extraordinary level of bureaucracy attached to this scheme, and it was really where it was being implemented in a far too stringent manner. For example, of course, you require a referral letter from your GP or a consultant doctor. In some cases, the doctors would have dictated the letter, but somebody else signed it on their behalf, as is pretty normal in any walk of life. Unfortunately, somebody took the view that no, that letter was not signed by the doctor. So you had your treatment in good faith, you came back, and then you found that actually you couldn't claim back the funding. Even where the doctor came along afterwards and wrote a letter to say, actually, that was my referral and I stand over it. Other cases where, for example, one that comes to mind, a lady travelled to have a hip replacement. It cost her €11,000. And I should say, by their nature, the people using these schemes don't necessarily have money, because if they had money, they might well have private health insurance and they might well get the treatment done through the health service. So this lady didn't have the money to pay for it, but her sister very kindly travelled with her and paid for the treatment on the basis that she would, of course, get it back when her sister was reimbursed. But again, the HSE said, no, actually, you should pay for the treatment, not your sister. Another problem we had was, of course, we have a border here where people travel in Northern Ireland to have treatment. And, for example, there are cataract treatments done in Northern Ireland, laser surgery and things like that. So people who are travelling to Northern Ireland, by its very nature, if you have a cataract problem, you're not hopefully going to drive to Northern Ireland. But the HSE was looking for proof of travel. They already had proof that the treatment had taken place and that the person had paid for it. So these were just too bureaucratic. I'm happy to say we put 18 recommendations to the HSE, and they accepted every one of them. And it's a real example, actually. It's a real good example, because I received the sign-off report from the HSE recently. All recommendations have been implemented, right up to us requesting them to put an independent appeals mechanism, because the appeals mechanism was within the same section within the HSE. So they've put together now an independent appeals mechanism. And what I really like about it is they themselves say they've adopted a patient-centred approach. We are always looking for public bodies to adopt a patient-centred approach, and that is the approach that they went beyond, actually, the recommendations and the things we asked them to do, and implemented it with absolute gusto, is how I would describe it. So, it's great when you get that kind of an outcome, and it's great for our own staff, because I would hear the staff talk about that lady I mentioned who travelled and didn't get the 11,000, and you'd hear staff say she has now got that back. So for us, it was really important that people who made the complaint to our office, they got the refunds they were entitled to. But so importantly, now the scheme is now running in a different way. And by the way, we no longer receive complaints about the scheme. And that's why I was saying to you at the outset that I would like to think the fact that we're getting more complaints, the complaints are in different areas, and that when we resolve that area, hopefully you don't want to receive more complaints with that area, but so you're constantly changing your horizon, the horizon in the area you're looking at.
It's great to hear, as you say. It's almost like a textbook example, isn't it? This is a kind of example you'd expect them to use in university or in school when they're trying to describe what an ombudsman does and what the purpose is. That thing about humanising the bureaucracy, that over bureaucratic approach. But then, as you say as well, the relationship that you can have with those bodies, where it's not a parent-child where you're just telling them off. They're taking that feedback, they're taking it on board. As you say, implementing it with gusto is the perfect way to do it. And as you say, people who, I won't say have never heard of your office, but maybe don't need to approach your office because those changes have taken place. They've actually felt the benefit of the work that your staff is doing. You're
absolutely right. And in fact, I would accept as people who haven't heard of our office. That's really, it gives you a great sense of achievement to think that people out there are benefiting from the work we're doing here, even though, as you say, they may never have heard of our office, and they certainly would not have made a complaint to the office. So, yeah, it's a particularly good example. And even the title, we call it In Sickness and in Debt, DEBT. And it was Siobhan in our own office here who coined that title, because what we found was people who had the stress of pain, the stress of a difficulty. And the one thing that stood out for me in this, Donal, was, as somebody who's unfortunately had a number of surgeries myself over the years, I can't think of anybody wanting to get on an airplane and go and have surgery and get back on an airplane to come home. So there is a term, a very unfortunate term, by the way, out there called medical tourism. Yeah, it's a dangerous term because, and I appreciate it reflects a certain maybe activity, but it crept into this area as well. And I do not believe the people that came to our office or the people that are availing of these schemes are in any form or on any form of tourism. They're going to have a difficulty and a problem that they've been dealing with resolved. Of course, the problem changed. They got the treatment, but then and some of these people had borrowed from credit unions and other institutions and now ended up having to pay those organizations, those institutions back, So it is, you're right. I think it is a really good example of what an ombudsman office can achieve.
I know one of the other issues that your office has consistently highlighted concerns about is access to transport for people with disabilities as well. Can you share some insights into what appears to be an ongoing problem?
Yes, this has proved more challenging for the office, and I think it goes back probably about 14 years because Emily O'Reilly was the first to do an investigation into the schemes. I won't go into there's a lot of detail on our website about it. And if somebody wants to have a look at the report called Grounded was actually the last action, I would call it almost, that Peter Tyndall did in terms of he pulled together all that had been done by the office prior to his retirement. And it gave an outline of the efforts the office has made. I have to say it's been disappointing, really, in that. So just to give you a flavour, there were various schemes assisting people with disabilities. And over the years, this office found a problem with two of the schemes. One of the schemes, bizarrely, applied until you turned 65 or 66.
Right.
So the idea was that you had a disability and we were going to assist you to adapt your car or to access transport. I think it dates from an outdated era when people thought, that age maybe shouldn't be out at all.
Mm.
It's extraordinary. But anyway, it stopped at 66. Emily called out this and said, this is a problem. And in fairness, the powers that be agreed it was a problem and agreed to review the scheme. So they, unfortunately, they closed the scheme on an interim basis to new applicants. And that's, I think, 14 years ago. So that's not an interim basis, as you can appreciate. Then another scheme, we found it to be way too restrictive in terms of the criteria because it was based on physical criteria rather than accessibility criteria. And we called out that this wasn't appropriate. However, for a different reason, somebody actually challenged the scheme in the High Court. And that was about 5 years ago. And the High Court actually found that the criteria that were being implemented in the statutory instrument were too far removed from the criteria in the main legislation. Now, you would have hoped that what we would do then, the government would have been to change the criteria. But no, actually, they actually incorporated the restrictive criteria into the primary legislation, again, on an interim basis almost 5 years ago. So I have been calling this out for some time now and will do so in my May annual report again. It's an example of where maybe we haven't achieved what we've set out to achieve yet, but we're not going to give up. And I do think one of the things about ombudsman offices are the continuity that you often get. You don't always see it in public bodies. So sometimes if you get a new CEO in an organization, they want to stamp their particular mark on the organization. That's not how we operate. So it's important for government and government departments to know that Peter Tyndall's reports, his investigations, and Emily O'Reilly's still stand, and we don't stop until they implement the recommendations of these reports. So we will continue to hold government to account and to seek more action in this area. I should acknowledge that there has been some work done in the area, and 2 years ago when I again drew attention to it, the Taoiseach, or Prime Minister of the day, in the Parliament that afternoon acknowledged that work needed to be done, and he did set up an interdepartmental group who have done some work in the area. But the real problem that we're calling is that no one has been held accountable in terms of a department appointed to resolve this problem. Mm-hmm. So we will keep highlighting this. And I think it's important that an ombudsman doesn't give up simply because they're not getting traction. And I hope maybe I'll come back and do a podcast with you at some stage and tell you about the success we've had in this area, Donal.
Well, that sounds good. And I think, as you say as well, yes, frustrating that it hasn't improved, but again, that point about an ombudsman scheme, and again, it's not unique to your office. It would be similar in the other offices in Ireland, and again, offices on this side of the water. Is that kind of institutional memory that you talk about, and continuing to hold people to account, and the tenacity that's required sometimes to get that fairness that's due. Well, we'll certainly have you back on that point if there's developments there. I know one of the things that we've talked a little bit about offline is that your office has been working on outreach to ensure that those who need your services the most are aware of them, particularly people with disabilities. Can you tell us a bit about those initiatives that your office is undertaking?
I remember at the OA conference, probably 3 years ago, I don't know, you ran a session where we talked about developing champions in the community. And that's the kind of approach we're taking. So we're working with a lot of different bodies, NGOs, people working in the disability area, to try and make sure that they know about our service and so that they can tell people that they interact with, because we can't always reach everybody. And sometimes I think it's unrealistic to think that everybody in society is going to know about the Ombudsman Office and what it does. So I think to try and overcome that, we do need these people who are active and engaged in the community. And we also engage heavily with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. We don't have the human rights. I know some of our colleagues have a human rights brief in different jurisdictions. There's a separate Human Rights Commission and Equality Commission here, and we engage very closely with them and we work very closely with them. And in fact, last year we developed a human rights-based approach manual for our staff to know how to deal with public bodies, because we think it's very important that we hold the public bodies to account when we're examining complaints. So we don't just look at, did the person get what they were entitled to or not, but how were they dealt with? Were they dealt with respect and dignity? And, that's not always the case. I should acknowledge the work of the Northern Irish Public Service Ombudsman in this regard. I'm a great believer in not reinventing the wheel. They had done a really good job in this area and a really good manual, and they were very kind to share their the manual and their thoughts, but we adapted it to our own particular needs here. We ran workshops here with people with disabilities to see what were the issues that were affecting them. And actually, mainly, they're the same issues that affect other people, except I think sometimes people with disabilities, as I said earlier, might have more need to access a service or might access a broader range of services. So it's not particularly that their issues or complaints that we deal with are that much different, but they face particular barriers. Another interesting thing that we're doing is we're attending 31 local authorities in Ireland, and each local authority area has what's called a public participation network. And that's a network of all of the voluntary bodies in that area. So, for example, some of them have maybe 700 organisations affiliated. Some of them have more. And I'm actually personally going to all of those. I've been through probably about a third of them so far. But by the end of next year, I would hope to have engaged and personally visited and met with and talked to all of those organisations, and obviously staff come with me and we provide information as well. And we just find this is a really good way of getting the message out into the community, what we can actually do for people. We also have redesigned our website to make it more accessible, and we have a specific complaint form for dealing with disability complaints. Now, when I say disability complaints, we've a role under the disability legislation here in relation to access to public bodies. So, for example, every public body should have an access officer, and obviously that person should be accessible to people with disabilities. So if that wasn't the case, people can come to us and make a complaint specifically for complaints about access under the Disability Act, because we found that the other form we were using wasn't helpful where people wanted to make that specific complaint. But we thought, you know what, it's better to divide this out because they're slightly different complaints in terms of particularly the information that we need from people. So we've now set that out separately. We've engaged in things like each county runs a social inclusion week, and we've engaged in those kind of events. And in fact, one of those social inclusion weeks, I remember there was a traveller workshop at it as well that I attended, and I think my mother would have been very impressed with the women there that day because they taught me how to sew in buttons, which my mother never managed to do. And it was a lovely project. They were reenacting or trying to keep alive a tradition that travellers used to have years ago. I had never heard of it, but they had a beady pocket, they called it. It was for all the world, like an apron. And traveller women would exchange. It might be a medal, it might be a button, it would be something shiny. So they'd sew that on. So if they were in one part of the country and they met somebody, they'd sew it on. Maybe they'd meet them 3 years later in another part, and they'd still have that. But anyway, they managed to teach me how to sew in buttons at this particular workshop. So, anything can happen at these events.
Well, it sounds great. And I know you at our conference, which is coming up in June later this year, I know you're going to be talking a bit more, going into a bit more detail. So I think that's going to be great for colleagues. As you say, I think one of the great things about this sector is people are open to learning from others and realize actually, you don't have to reinvent the wheel or get consultants in. There's that expertise out there that we can learn from each other.
That's true. Somebody has probably done it before. And even as I mentioned, the model in the way we were working was something I picked up from the previous OA conference. So it's kind of nice to see it in action maybe and coming back again.
Very good. Nice book ending we can have there. I know another thing from one of the conversations we've been having is that you have a kind of ongoing demographic survey of complainants to your office. Is there something from that? What does that show in relation to people with disabilities?
Yeah, no, we only started it last year, so it's off a pretty low level, if you like, at this stage, or a short term, I should say, rather than no level. But I should stress it's a voluntary survey which asks 5 questions. We've lined the questions up the same as they are in the census of population here, so that one, they've been tried and tested in a sense, and also it allows us to maybe measure. And it's particularly around finding, are there groups of people, or are there people not coming to us that we're not reaching out to? It's age, ethnicity, nationality, education and disability are the things we're measuring. Now, about 30% of people voluntarily respond to this survey, which is not bad for surveys. We'd like to get it higher, but we're always conscious, and it's done separately. So you make your complaint, and then we ask you if you'd like to do the survey, you go to a separate link because it's not linked to your particular complaint. Because I know people are always worried about this kind of information, But so far we've been pleased and surprised to find that 40% of people, 43% actually of people who are making complaints to the office say they have a disability, which is quite high, as you can imagine. And it compares to 32% in the population generally. Now, disability is very broadly defined. It's very broadly defined. Okay. But it tells us that that is one category of people that we are reaching. Interestingly, the category of people we're not reaching, and I suspect this could be an issue for other ombudsman offices, are the younger cohort of people. They're not inclined to come to us to the same extent. So we have to think about how we would reach them. But it is pleasing to see that people with disabilities are actually hearing about us and coming to us.
Yeah, that is really good to, because I don't have kind of figures to compare it to, but anecdotally there is always a thought across, all areas, not just ombudsman, but other areas of public services and other oversight bodies, that you really don't get that kind of representation. The statistics don't match up. So I think, well, I suspect it reflects well on that outreach work you're doing and those high level reports that you've done that are raising awareness and then making your office more accessible.
I think so. And actually, that's a good point you make about the reports, Donal, because they do catch media attention and they will get covered and they will get publicity. So from the point of view of getting the message out there, I should say, of course, we do, as I'm sure all other offices do, we do a lot of media work. We have local radio here. I've probably been on all of them at this stage and maybe on the second round of them. So we do a lot of the usual type of outreach through national media. But you do need something to hook that on. You need to have a story that the media are interested in, and those kind of stories are certainly, those kind of improvements and those changes are something that the media is certainly interested in.
Well, I think that's probably a really good point to leave it on. I mean, Ger, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great to have you on.
It's been great to be here. Thanks very much, Donal.
And it's just been great to hear, that you're continuing to shine a light on these issues that are affecting those with disabilities, and also quite clearly making your services more accessible to all. So I also look forward to hearing even more in more detail later in the year. To our listeners, if you or someone you know has been affected by the issues we've discussed today, do please get in touch with the Ombudsman. You'll also find links in the podcast description below to organisations who can provide further support as well. You can stay connected with us on LinkedIn, X, Instagram and Threads under Ombudsman Association. And don't forget to follow us on Spotify and YouTube for more episodes of That OA Thing. If you found today's discussion valuable, please share it with your colleagues. And we hope you'll join us again next time.